Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Steve Francis, and I'm President and Lead Strategist of Franchise D&I Solutions, and I'm honored to be moderating this panel of esteemed experts in the topic that we're going to discuss, building inclusive communities. Can DEI succeed without inclusive neighborhoods? Subtopic, children growing up with diversity. It's a mouthful. However, we've got a lot of mouths to fill up this topic with some very passionate expertise. And I wanted to thank Move to Prosper and Amy for bringing us together today. And I wanted to ask Shiloh if she could maybe tell us what Move to Prosper is, and why is Move to Prosper hosting this important roundtable discussion. Shiloh, Todorov.
Thanks. Good morning, Steve, and thank you for being our lead-off moderator this morning. So Move to Prosper, for those who don't know, is working with single moms to give them the opportunity to choose where they want to raise their children instead of allowing where they can afford the rent to be the sole dictator of that factor. We provide 3 years of temporary rental support and combine that with life coaching to help the moms build skills in budgeting, career building, health and wellness, and to really put them on a path to economic stability for the good of generations of our families here in Columbus to come. So, what does that have to do with inclusive housing? Here's the idea behind today's full day of panels featuring Rick Kahlenberg. We've teamed up, Move to Prosper has, with civic and corporate leaders in Central Ohio to launch, today is a launch of a series of conversations that will advance the understanding of the need for inclusive housing in Central Ohio. So what do we mean by inclusive housing? A region where all families are able to have the opportunity to choose where they would like to live, work, play, raise their families, including in higher resourced areas of the regions, which are probably convenient to their jobs. The Columbus area, I'm sure many of you know, has been the only region in Ohio experiencing population growth for several decades now. And while housing production at all price levels has not kept up for the past decade, in fact, we've only built 60% of needed units to satisfy that growing demand. So in addition to national trends creating pressure on housing affordability, undersupply, underfunding, labor and material shortages, some of it's NIMBYism, our region suffers from extreme economic segregation. And we know that from a University of Toronto study led by Richard Florida in 2015, which found that Columbus is the second most economically segregated community in the country after Austin, Texas. It found an environment in Columbus where low-wage workers have fewer housing choices, limited access to high-resource communities and schools, high transportation costs, and time burdens to get to the available jobs. And you'll hear today how this segregation affects all of us. There is lots of evidence to suggest that kids are not equipped for 21st century workplaces. And that's why this discussion this morning is about how businesses think about their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So today kicks off what we plan to be a year-long series of conversations that help expand corporate and civic leaders' minds and the general public as we understand the need and the roadblocks to truly creating inclusive housing for Central Ohio. So that's what brings us here, Steve.
Well, thank you, Shiloh. A very comprehensive overview, and thanks for that information. You know, Move to Prosper and Amy Clavin, they couldn't do this. Bring people like Rick Kahlenberg from the Century Foundation, a senior fellow from the Century Foundation, to impart this great knowledge on such an important topic without sponsors. And we're going to show you those sponsors. And we really appreciate, maybe you can throw up the hand clap in your Zoom platform for these great sponsors that have helped make this possible, this roundtable this morning. Please upload any types of additional support that you can provide Move to Prosper through the chat box. And I think that the notice has already come up about that. And we'll also be aggressively encouraging you to use the chat box to upload questions, comments. We're going to try to respond to some of those in real time, particularly during the Q&A session and the panel discussion. So why are we here today? Building inclusive communities. Can DEI succeed without inclusive neighborhoods? I don't want to assume, as a diversity consultant, that any of you in this audience fully understands what the words diversity, equity, inclusion, and we can add access, really means. Our firm, Franchise DEI Solutions, approaches defining these terms in three ways: with a one-word theme, with a more Webster Dictionary traditional definition, and with a diversity best practices definition. And for the sake of time, I'll focus on the diversity best practices, the proposed definition in bold font there for each word. So first, diversity. Unique differences in thought, beliefs, values, and life experiences among many other human and cultural characteristics based on who we are and where we come from. Who we are, that's the DNA. You can't change that. You're born with it. Where we come from, what side of the railroad tracks, river, et cetera, that you grew up on within your environment. What zip code, et cetera, which obviously impacts housing as well. Equity, ensuring, that takes affirmative action, ensuring that people and circumstances, there's equity with regard to people and circumstances, like living circumstances, are provided with exactly what they need to have the opportunity, be successful, and live a full life, understanding that fair is not always equal, and that equity is not the same as uniform equality. The next word, inclusion. If we could just advance the slide. Inclusion, leveraging, engaging, and valuing diverse human and cultural characteristics to help deliver the most creative, innovative, and impactful outcomes for employees, clients, customers, and our society and our neighborhoods. There's a saying that diversity is a reality, inclusion is a choice. We used to use that phrase at Honda quite a bit. So this is the business case for diversity. You leverage, engage, value, develop, include, empower all the diversity to deliver those most creative, innovative, and impactful outcomes. That's the business case for diversity. And then finally, access, ensuring that everyone, regardless of their diverse human and cultural characteristics, has the opportunity to realize their full potential, attain their full rights and privileges, and occupy their desired status in our society. Obviously, that also includes affordable, safe housing with all the amenities and green space and all those kinds of things. So I hope those definitions were helpful and set the backdrop for why we believe DEI is important for neighborhoods to succeed. We're going to talk about today's agenda. We've got an aggressive agenda. We've got a lot of information to pack into a very short period of time. So we're going to introduce you to Rick shortly, and he and I are going to have a dialogue. The panel discussion, we'll ask some questions of the panel, and they'll share their passion, knowledge, and experience for this topic. And then we're going to let you, the audience, participate in a Q&A. Again, definitely have the chat box with your questions, and we'll address them as many as we can. And then we're going to talk about the next steps. This is not, we are probably talking to the choir or preaching to the choir. However, we want you as people that can make change, can make an impact, can develop policy and all those things to change the situation, to really weigh in with some informative information. So with that, housekeeping, again, please put the questions in the chat box or raise your hand, the raise hand function in the Zoom platform if you have a question or comment. Please keep your mics off during the presentation. And our goal here today is to make sure we discuss ways that our region, with its diversity, can allow children to grow up in the richness of diversity and become better equipped to succeed in the workplace of the future. I was privileged to have cross-culturalization through living in a number of different neighborhoods with different ethnicities, and that helped me develop an appreciation for differences and the value that those differences bring to the quality of life. For those involved in DEI programs in your workspace, in your schools, and in your community, we hope this workshop will help you understand why the discussion must include, diverse neighborhoods as we build our societies. And our hope for today is that you leave with action steps for broadening the DEI discussion to include inclusive communities with inclusive housing. So with that, the table being set, we're going to move on to introduce our esteemed guest, Rick Kahlenberg. He just raised his hand, and there's all kinds of things that I could say about Rick. I've had the pleasure of meeting Rick and the panelists this past week, and we had a wonderful time getting to know each other better last night in person, safely. But Rick is the director of K-12 equity and a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. It's a century-plus-year-old think tank based in Washington, D.C. So we're very privileged to have him. And actually, I learned last night that Rick found Move to Prosper. We didn't reach out to him necessarily. He found Move to Prosper and the great work it does in housing segregation. And so he wrote an article about Move to Prosper that really put a bright spotlight on some of the issues that we're going to be discussing today. He's an author and editor of 17 books, and he's been called the intellectual father of the economic integration movement. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the American Prospect, including an article about the success of Central Ohio housing mobility program, Move to Prosper, as I mentioned earlier. Rick, welcome to our presentation this morning.
Steve, great to be with you and great to be with everyone here.
Well, I wanted to, try to really crystallize the connection between DEI and housing. And I know that you're probably the best person for that discussion. Tell me how you found Move to Prosper. How did that come on your radar and lead to the great article that you wrote?
Well, I came across Move to Prosper when I was doing research on what I call the invisible walls that are keeping us apart, keeping us segregated in different communities based on race and economic status. And I love the concept that here was a program that was trying to help low income or low wage mothers and their children find better opportunities. Because in my research, I've found that low-wage people are just like everyone else. They want good schools for their kids, safe neighborhoods, and here Move to Prosper was doing something on its own to provide those opportunities by allowing, providing some support to allow single mothers to and their kids to have an opportunity to to move. And what really struck me was that this is a completely voluntary program. There are lots of programs throughout the country that are known as housing mobility programs that are often government sponsored that provide these types of opportunities. They exist in Chicago and Dallas and Baltimore and other communities, but almost always they're the results of litigation. Steve, you and I are recovering lawyers, and that's been a positive thing that the law profession has brought us, a remedy when housing authorities consciously segregated communities. These housing mobility programs were created. But I
will also say, Rick, that most gains in diversity, equity, and inclusion are as a result of litigation. So definitely similar trends there.
That's right. But what's exciting about what you're doing here in Columbus is this was based on research. People read the research that Raj Chetty at Harvard and others have conducted, finding, one of the very best things you can do for families is to provide them the opportunity to be in a higher a community that has more resources and those strong schools. That it makes a world of difference, particularly if students and children move before they're age 13. They're likely to make $300,000 more over a lifetime than if they are remain in concentrated poverty, where everyone around them is also low income. And so it's a wonderful program. I'm excited to be here to talk more about it.
Well, I want to try to level set about our region and housing segregation, economic segregation, and talk about what that means. We're going to look at some maps as well. But I shared an article from the Columbus Dispatch with you last evening that just came out on the 27th. And it was right on point with our discussion. Affordable housing advocates, Columbus is not spending enough on affordable housing. There was a $50 million bond issue that the city of Columbus was awarded, and only 10.3 million of that money is going towards affordable housing. And the advocates screamed loudly that we need more than the 50 million total bond going towards affordable housing to make a appreciable dent in this issue. Talk about that a little bit before we talk about these maps that we're going to look at.
Absolutely. This is a crisis. It's a crisis in Columbus. It's a crisis throughout the country. We have, since the 1980s, really cut back on our support for affordable housing programs. To take one example, many of you may be familiar with the housing choice voucher. It's it's otherwise known as Section 8 support for housing, and only 1/4 of those who qualify for that support actually get it. And so we're not devoting the resources we need to affordable housing. I see there's kind of a two-part problem. One part is that we need to provide more resources, federal, state, and local resources to build affordable housing and support it. And then the second piece is we need to bring down some of the barriers that are imposed by government, where government's actually causing the problem by not artificially driving up the price of market rate housing, non-subsidized housing. And so these are two big pieces of the problem.
Yeah, the article talked about an estimated 54,000 low and moderate income households in Franklin County are spending more than half of their incomes on housing, according to the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio. So the problem is staggering. More than 462,000 Columbus area residents are renters, and there are more renters, 55.1%, than property owners, according to the latest US Census, the 2020 census. Well, let's look at some of these maps. It might help demonstrate in graphic terms the housing segregation issue here. And I know that the Kirwan Institute has some very great maps on redlining and things like that, and the history of how our neighborhoods were shaped, and some of that is in here as well. But I'll certainly defer to you, Rick, to take us through what these maps show us.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So there are going to be 4 maps in all that we'll show. This first map goes back to the 1930s, when the federal government was involved in something many of you are familiar with, redlining, where there was a decision made about which communities would get public support to ensure housing mortgages. And the green areas, the dark blue areas are those areas where the federal government would provide generous support to ensure that people had opportunity to receive a federally insured mortgage that would make it affordable for them. The redlined areas, by contrast, are those where the federal government said it's actually suggested it's hazardous to invest and insure mortgages. And we all know that those red lines were drawn predominantly based on race. And that's one of the key messages that I want everyone to understand, if they don't already, which is that we think of communities as, we know there are predominantly Black communities, we know there are predominantly white communities, we know there are more affluent communities and less affluent communities, and we somehow think this is kind of foreordained by the market. It's not. This was socially engineered by the segregation was socially engineered by the federal government and by state and local governments. That's from the 1930s. Redlining, thankfully, was made illegal under the 1968 Fair Housing Act. But the bad news is, if you look at the second map, we still have government-imposed rules that keep us separate and unequal. And so in the map with the blue and the green, legends are distinguishing between those areas where you can build all sorts of housing, multifamily housing, single family housing, and the like. You can build lots of different types of housing. And contrast that with the dark blue areas, where there is one kind of housing that you can build. It's illegal to build duplexes, triplexes, small apartment buildings, all of which we know on average are more affordable than a single family home. There's nothing wrong with a single family home. Lots of people live in them and enjoy them. No one's talking about taking that away. But what these laws do is say you do not have the freedom to build anything but a single family home. And you can see there's some unfortunate overlap between the 1936 map, which was racially engineered, and the map today, which distinguishes between those areas which are going to be open essentially to working class people, and those which are going to be more likely to be prohibitive, price prohibitive. And then
let's flash to the next 2 maps, and then we're going to introduce our panel. But I know that this is something that I think really crystallizes the point as well from the Kirwan Institute.
That's right. So many of you are familiar with the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State. They've done wonderful work to identify those communities that provide high opportunity for adults and for children. So these are communities where there are access to good jobs, access to high-performing schools for kids, safe neighborhoods, all the things that really everyone from any background, any racial or economic background is looking for. And the dark red areas are the very high opportunity zones, and then you see other that provide less opportunity. And again, think of the overlap between redlining, exclusionary zoning, and where the opportunity lies. And then tragically, the fourth map tells us that in Columbus, the African-American population is concentrated in the very lowest opportunity neighborhoods. We think we've solved some of these problems because we made it illegal to discriminate based on race. We made it illegal to redline, but the legacy of past discrimination and the reality of current zoning policies that forbid multifamily housing can be seen in where Black people tend to live in Columbus.
Well, thanks so much, Rich, for laying the groundwork and setting the stage for our esteemed panel. I wanted to have I think there's a new partner organization joining us. Can anybody expound on that?
Yes, so Erase the Space, which is a nonprofit organization that helps students interact with people of different backgrounds and from different areas, has joined this morning as a partner. So welcome, Erase the Space. And Derek Birch is here with us. He is streaming this conversation in his classroom at Olentangy High School today. So yes, wonderful, thank you.
Awesome. Oh, there he is. Thanks for your partnership. Well, we have a passionate, experienced, and knowledgeable panel here in Central Ohio to address this topic. The first member of the panel I want to introduce is Catherine Kennedy. She's a lead organizer with the Columbus Communities Coalition for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, also known as CCC, the number 4, DEI. It's a grassroots organization of people and local organizations in various communities around the city that have joined together in the aftermath of George Floyd. Catherine is an Upper Arlington resident, and she's middle school PTO, DEI committee chair. She's founding board member of Equal UA, or Equal Upper Arlington, a grassroots community organization which champions diversity, equity, and inclusion in Upper Arlington. And she's engaged in a number of other nonprofit education, health, and cultural efforts throughout Central Ohio. Welcome, Catherine Kennedy.
Thank you.
Also, we have Judy Sonn, the managing partner of the Center for Leadership and Innovation. Now, Judy comes with over 40 years of experience in human capital, working across a variety of industries, including manufacturing, healthcare, retail, banking. And, she's an activist whose interests include the advancement of women, diversity, and the elimination of racism. She's personally dedicated to the issues of leading sustainable change with diverse, low-income, high school education, as well as affordable housing. Welcome, Judy.
Thank you.
And finally, Shiloh, who you've heard from, Shiloh Todorov, joined Move to Prosper fairly recently. However, she's currently the development director for the organization as of June of this year. She has over a decade of advocacy of nonprofit in the nonprofit space, including her previous roles with various organizations, including executive director of the German Village Society, and as the marketing PR director for the Wellington School, a school I'm familiar with as well. Prior to her career with nonprofits and development, she was a television journalist, most recently serving as managing editor for KETV.com. She was born and raised in Nebraska and holds a master's in broadcasting and public policy from the American University in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Shiloh.
I'll give you a go Huskers on that, Steve.
Well, so much to get to, so little time. I wanted everybody to sort of have an opportunity to introduce themselves, but how do you think the community would be different if employees came in with knowledge of and comfort with other people that don't actually look like them or even think like them or love like them or worship like them? This thing we call diversity, equity, and inclusion. Can I get thoughts from each of the panelists on that question?
Hi, Steve. I'm happy to jump in there. As one who has wrestled with this issue in the business community for many, many years, first had the opportunity back at the DuPont company in the early 90s to work with the diversity effort. I will tell you, it would just be a godsend if our students and young professionals could enter the workforce ready to go. Our world has big, complicated problems, and we need young professionals that can contribute to solving those problems. And they are even beyond just the racial diversity in the US. We're talking global markets, global challenges, and the need for innovation.
Catherine, you have any thoughts?
Absolutely. And I think I'm almost thinking, as someone who works in the community and not in the corporate world, it's beneficial on the flip side in terms of when businesses prioritize the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion and incorporate that into their trainings and into their consciousness and their values for their organizations, what that does when adults then engage in their communities, the experience of working across differences in the workplace can translate to changing things in their communities, how they operate in school boards and city council engagement. So I think it's incredibly important that the business sector is a leader in this work.
By the way, Catherine, I did get your blue shirt memo this morning. So
oh, good.
We're looking very good.
I'm sorry no one else got it.
Shiloh, your thoughts?
Well, I would share a couple of the stories that I've heard from our Move to Prosper moms, because I think they're really kind of on both sides of this, right? For themselves, they're alongside their coaches, they're thinking about their career pathways in a different way. And so they are kind of working through and having the support of their own thoughts about how do I get a certification or how do I ask for a raise, right? So that's sort of the one side of it on the mom side. But I think starting much earlier for the children that our Move to Prosper moms are raising, and there are 18 kids in our programs, there are stories about their children going from being the bad kids, right? Kind of spending a lot of time out of the classroom in the principal's office to getting to a new school that it does have higher resources and being able to test those children into gifted programs. Or, and I think these are much more things that all of us can relate to, they've gone to the new schools and been able to very quickly sort of find their people and find their activities. The opportunity to be on the flag corps is one of the stories that our moms was telling last night, right? Or for the first time have exposure to a band, right? And to be able to play an instrument. So I think that not only are the Move to Prosper children having the opportunity to benefit from a more diverse place that they've moved into, but the Move to Prosper moms also say that they're seeing the results of it for those classmates as well, right? As the children are coming around and getting to know the neighbors and really being able to interact with their kids at a one-to-one peer level and just seeing a different, someone that looks different from them or that came from a different neighborhood. So I think that's sort of the lens that I would put on it as it relates to Move to Prosper.
Great, thank you. Next question I have, it's a 30,000 foot question. Why is housing as a whole integral to addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion in our communities? What does housing have to do with advancing or addressing DEI in our community? Catherine, you want to start with this one?
Sure. And I know you're thinking back to the story I shared last night, which I'll share today. You know, it is absolutely integral. And we were laughing last night because I shared that when I first started to engage in the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we happened to be in the process of electing city council members for Upper Arlington. And I had gotten to know one in particular. And, you know, I shared with her, I'm like, the most important thing to me is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she said, well, I'm really focused on affordable housing. And I said, well, then I guess our missions are not aligned. And, you know, I look back on that and think, oh my gosh, she must have been banging her head against the wall. But, you know, I think if I bring anything to the table, it is the blinders that, you know, those of us who have grown up in areas that have been redlined but were greenlined. I grew up in Upper Arlington, and I was not exposed to diversity. I was not exposed to the history of how our suburbs and our different, you know, living spaces were created. And so I had no concept to connect how diversity, equity, and inclusion is related to housing. And it was only after learning the full history that it clicked. And then I went back and called our councilwoman and said, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And so that is critical. I think inclusive housing is critical to diversity, equity, inclusion, but I would also say that the work of DEI, especially in these high opportunity neighborhoods, is critical to get people to change their hearts and minds, to push their representatives to make changes at the policy and law level so that we can have inclusive housing. And then from there, when more diversity is brought into a community, that community has a welcoming and inclusive environment so that the people can thrive and also share all their wealth of experiences with the community, and then we retain people. So it's kind of it's cyclical, but I definitely think they're intertwined very closely.
Shiloh, your thoughts?
Well, I point to Chetty's research and made mention of Raj Chetty, which the Move to Prosper program is based on, right? Just by moving to a higher resource neighborhood, children in Chetty's study were experiencing like 32% higher rate of going to college, much higher incomes to the tune of, you know, $500,000 over the course of their lives. So for them, that's creating pathways, in part because they had the opportunity to live in more diverse neighborhoods. For us, if you just want to get real selfish about it, right? These are now children that have been invested in a way that probably means that over the course of their life, not only will they not consume government programs, right? But we've made them into higher taxpayers. So it is for the good of all of us that we have more pathways for more people to neighborhoods that really welcome everyone.
Thank you for that. Judy, you want to bring up the rear on this one?
Yes, my eyes to the need about affordable housing really became opened as a result of being involved at Cristo Rey Inner City High School over the past 5 years. And I really need to acknowledge my husband for pulling me into this. 5 years ago, he partnered with the biology teacher there and created an introduction to engineering program for senior students. And 5 years later, we now find ourselves supporting 12 college students with scholarships. And they're not full scholarships, but they're meaningful scholarships. And we're not doing this alone. Now another friend has joined in to double the magnitude. And so I start thinking about what is the opportunity of this? And in working with these students, of course, they really have become our teachers. And the learning is they don't live in safe neighborhoods. There are bullets flying next door. Their iPhones are cracked, making it very difficult to learn. And so in addition to the scholarships, we now have ventured into housing and offer 5 students. So we're not at the family level, we're really at the young professional and college level, 5 students affordable housing throughout their academic years so that they can get out into the world and be successful. So eyes wide opened as a result of that experience.
Awesome. Well, I wanted to go 30,000 foot with this same question. We've heard the Central Ohio perspective, but Rick, can you chime in on why is housing integral to addressing DEI in our communities?
Absolutely, Steve. And I know you're doing this great work on DEI in the workplace, and it would be so much easier for people in your position if we got the housing situation and the education situation properly addressed, because we all know that attitudes and relationships begin early. The fact is that 3/4 of American school children attend the neighborhood school. They are attending school in, it's affected directly by where they live. And there's a long line of research to suggest that children are much more tolerant and are much more open-minded when they have a chance to experience diversity early in their lives. And so the fact that our neighborhoods are economically and racially segregated, and our schools are economically and racially segregated, really makes the goal of public education so much harder to achieve. Part of the goal was social mobility, as Shiloh mentioned, giving children an opportunity to do better. But part of it is social cohesion as well, that we want people to be able to get along with those of different backgrounds. And the research shows that the number one reason that people are fired on the job is not that they're incompetent. It's that they don't get along with colleagues, and we all know these folks. But oftentimes it has to do with not getting along with colleagues of different racial or economic backgrounds because they didn't experience that diversity at a younger age, or in their neighborhood got to know neighbors who were different backgrounds. So I think the framing may have been around, is it possible to do DEI work without addressing housing? I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I think it's central to address housing in order to make diversity, equity, and inclusion a reality.
Thank you for that. There's a lot of research on social determinants of health. And I've heard a term recently called political determinants of health, such as zoning, et cetera. So I'm going to ask the panelists, let's start with you, Shiloh. What role do you think society plays in terms of the DEI impact on our neighborhoods versus the elected officials' impact on making sure we have DEI and inclusive neighborhoods?
Well, if you set aside gerrymandering, it's sort of a circle, right? Voters pick the people they want to see making the policy sometimes. But I do think, and I think the maps that Rick shared earlier are so sort of conclusive in helping to really show these were policy choices. This is decades of various levels of government choosing to set aside neighborhoods and raise walls and say, you, not you, right? So do we continue to vote for those people? Sure, but sometimes only 15% of the population is voting, right? So society is certainly setting the pace for policymakers to follow, but I guess I come at this maybe from a policy angle, and I think that's a big part of, again, to sort of infuse Move to Prosper into this. This is a big part of why we are researching our results so that we can really say to policymakers, here's where the problems are, here's a solution that is working, right? And we'll continue to do that as we go from the 10 family pilot into the Empower 100 program.
Thank you, Shiloh. Judy, your thoughts?
I can speak from the business community and tell you that while these efforts have been underway since the 80s, we know there hasn't been enough progress. But there are some excellent leaders out there. And there are business leaders that think very carefully about the kind of culture they want to create in their organization, the kind of talent they want to bring in, and they work hard at accelerating that transformation. And what my experience has taught me is it's never a one and done. We have to keep learning and stretching and growing and creating partnerships with diverse recruiters that can bring in the talent that we need and offer a new lens to our teams so that they can be innovative and serve new markets. So this work is occurring. Is it fast enough? No. Is it frustrating for me at times? Absolutely. But do I ever give up? Never. There's just this fundamental belief that every associate matters. And the extent to which we can empower people to use their voice, use their creativity, and believe that they matter, we're all going to be better for it.
Thank you. Catherine?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think, as we've seen, the people who hold the power to make these actual changes in policy, our lawmakers, are very impacted by whether or not they're going to get reelected, or how are they going to get elected and on what platform. And so I do think society has a huge impact on what those leaders choose to prioritize in terms of the policies that they pursue. And I think the business sector has a huge impact. And so I think it almost needs to be collaborative of, hoping that business leaders who hold a lot of weight politically put themselves out there, insisting on policy change from their, from the representatives. And then I think it's also the grassroots work of getting communities to understand how these things are all connected, and then mobilizing and seeking that change from their elected officials and having people ask those questions. We've seen it in Upper Arlington right now. All of a sudden the local elections are so much more at the forefront of people's attention, I think almost ever since I can remember, because I think people are really realizing the impact that local elections make on things like education and zoning and housing and development and density. So it's hopeful, but there's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of education to share across communities.
Thank you, Catherine. Rick, you want to weigh in on this one? Again, social determinants of health, political determinants of health. Which one do you think tips the scale most? Are social impact related to DEI and the understanding of our society about DEI, or the political understanding and impact related to DEI?
Yeah, I think both are important. I think the political impact is one we can really try to address. And I'm glad, Stephen, your question, you mentioned, zoning explicitly, because I don't think people fully appreciate the ways in which our public policies enacted by political figures purposely exclude people and keep us apart and frustrate the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In many of you may know that that famous Norman Rockwell painting from the 1960s, where a young Black child, Ruby Bridges, 6-year-old, is being escorted by these enormous FBI agents into a school. And the reason the FBI was required is because there were these screaming, hysterical white mobs that were trying to keep little Ruby out of the school because of the color of her skin. And I think most of us now recognize how wrong that was. But we have these policies in place that say, nothing but a single family home in this community that have a similar effect. It's less dramatic, and we don't see it. We don't think about it as much. But the effective message is, if you can't make enough in order to afford a detached single family home, we don't want you in this community. We don't want your kids in our schools. And it's less visible, but just as destructive as the exclusion in the past. So I think getting those policies right is important. And we may get into this in our last few minutes, but there's some encouraging news out there from Charlotte and Minneapolis and some other communities where they are beginning to make some reform efforts.
Excellent, excellent.
Steve, I'd like to offer one other thought.
Sure.
I think there absolutely, as we all know, there's more that the business leaders in this community can do to lean in with our political standards and policymakers. There are leaders who have been watching and many that have not. But there has been a huge demographic shift in this country. And some know, but maybe not enough, that in 1980, here's a fun fact, less than 20% of the US was diverse. Today, the majority of youth under the age of 18 are diverse. The majority. So who's going to make up our working population by the year 2030? The majority will be diverse. And business leaders will want kids that are well educated, well prepared, able to come in and function effectively with others that don't look like them. So there's something at stake here for them. Their future organization is about to be birthed, and it doesn't look anything like it used to look.
Well, thank you. Maybe we have time for one more question for the panel before we transition to Q&A, but I wanted to ask each of you to respond how you believe DEI programs in nonprofits and corporation, whatever organization or space you are, how can these DEI programs be tweaked to have a unique focus that includes discussions about neighborhood inclusion? Going back to, OSU used to have a national conference on race, diversity, and learning. And I used to speak and present at that yearly. And I was an advocate that in primary, secondary, and certainly college and grad schools, there should be 101, 201, 301 courses on diversity, equity, and inclusion to prepare our young people to enter the diverse society that the 2020 census tells us is already here and that Judy just commented on. This is a business case issue. It's not a kumbaya issue. So how can we really intentionally tweak our DEI programs and initiatives to include this neighborhood segregation / neighborhood inclusion imperative as a discussion point? Shiloh, you start.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of the work that's ahead for Move to Prosper as we
sort of a next step, right?
as we grow from 10 to 100 families. I think some of the work that we've done in the first 3 years and that will continue sort of, I would say, on steroids as we move forward, right, is the kinds of conversations that we're able to have with the landlords that we partner with, and some of the work that's going on in complement to the Move to Prosper. There's a question in the chat about SOI, that source of income. We have worked collaboratively with another organization that has been working with suburban leaders and with the city of Columbus. The city of Columbus and a couple of the suburbs so far have passed source of income legislation. And that is to say that landlords cannot discriminate against the kind of income that supports your rent. So many people's head will go to Section 8, right? You'll read an apartment listing and it'll say no Section 8 allowed, right? So Columbus and these suburbs have chosen to outlaw that kind of messaging, and we continue to work in that space. But when a landlord partners with Move to Prosper and says, yes, we'd like to have some of your participants in our homes, we go through a pretty intensive diversity, equity, and inclusion training with them so that they can better understand some of the life circumstances and the different point of view that these residents are bringing into the community. And we do that on the other side with the residents as well, helping them to understand what are their responsibilities as a tenant. And even if they've had really bad relationships in the past in their previous neighborhood with a previous landlord, how can we turn that around and make that into a positive thing if everybody kind of understands where they are? So I think that's some of the work in that sort of neighborhood and community space that Move to Prosper has done and will be doing more of.
Thank you. What's your thoughts, Catherine?
I would go back again to ensuring that these DEI programs and trainings include the history. I think when you do that, you automatically connect the work of DEI to housing, and you make that connection between place and people. And then additionally, and I'm thinking of Derek Birch and Erase the Space, that aspect of it needs to be included, that it's not only learning about how housing has created this division and segregation of people, but then learning the skills to be able to erase the space. How do we then have intergroup contact and relationship building that is based on everyone coming to the table as equals? So I think it's knowing the history, understanding how housing and place is integral to the conversation of DEI, but then also how the people who are in those different places, how do we connect with one another in a way that is, nurturing and fruitful, and it brings out all those wonderful things that we talk about when we have diversity in the room, that everybody benefits.
Thank you. Judy?
I love that, what was just mentioned. And because I am not a housing expert and I did not know about redlining. I grew up in a bubble, right? And so I'm appalled to learn that. Would not have wanted to have stood for that. But what I can tell you about teaching and training that is going on, the two most successful approaches that I have seen us take over all the years is one centered around expanding our listening. We had to learn as leaders, particularly senior leaders, we have a lot of waxy buildup in our ears and we don't listen. And so if we're not listening, there is no breakthrough that's going to come through. And that's not only around diversity and inclusion, that's around new products, new markets. And expanding our listening has been a big intentional focus and part of every training that's going on within the business organization that I've been a part of, to really seek to understand what someone is saying. The second thing is really encouraging people to move beyond conflict and shift it into collaboration. It's just a different C word, but that conflict word, most of us are conflict avoiders. We don't want to get into that. It is way easier to judge and talk about others than it is to actually confront it and shift it to collaboration. So we actually equip our workforce with the tools to do that. Is it perfect? No. Is there a process? Yes. It's not magic. It is possible. It's getting people comfortable with it. It's creating the expectation as leaders that it will occur, that you're not going to let this build up and you're going to move past it and shift to new possibilities.
Those are great nuggets, Judy. In my DEI training, I always, as a cultural comment communication skill, encourage people to listen to understand instead of listen to respond. When you're responding, you already got your bias kicking in and you know what you believe and you know what you want to say. But if you listen to understand, you're open to different viewpoints. You're receptive to the fact that you don't know everything. Rick, you want to round out this question with your thoughts?
Sure. And Steve, that's so much harder to do in practice than we all think. But that I agree with you. We've got to really listen to others. And let me agree also with what Catherine said earlier about broadening the DEI curriculum in the workplace to include this history, to include housing issues, because that's such an important piece of it. The other thing I'll mention is that business groups can and are getting involved in some of these public policy discussions about exclusionary zoning and other policies. So to give you one example, in California, many of the Silicon Valley employers have gotten heavily involved in statewide discussions about ending exclusionary zoning and legalizing other multifamily housing in different communities. And they did so for two reasons. One is the reason we've been discussing, that they recognize they'll be more successful if their employees understand diversity, equity, and inclusion and can have experienced it early in life. But the other reason has to do with affordability. So the Silicon Valley employers have helped fund a group called YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard, to counteract the NIMBYs. And they funded those efforts in order to get reform in legislation to address housing affordability issues. When you have only one form of housing available, single-family homes, it artificially drives up the price of housing because it's limiting the supply of more affordable types of homes. And in California, it's become very acute, where employers are concerned people aren't moving here because it's become so expensive. And I know Columbus is not where California is, but certainly from what I've been reading, housing is becoming much more unaffordable in Columbus. And so this is going to be a growing issue for employers to address. So I think there are two big reasons employers want to tackle this issue: diversity, equity, inclusion, and affordability as well.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the entire panel weighing in on such important topics and providing such important insight and solutions. There's over 50 participants in this webinar with great experience as well, with insight, with the ability to make an impact. And so I want the questions to start flooding into the chat box. I know several have already been there. Also, in the spirit of reverse panel, you've got a lot of experience where you sit as participants in this webinar on how you've seen things work well to impact neighborhood inclusion and inclusive housing, and to address some of the zip code issues and redlining issues we've been discussing. So weigh in on your best practices, things that you've seen work well and not work well, to provide your insight and wisdom that others can try as best practices. Call that sort of a reverse panel. And Kathy Fox, I'm going to impose upon you to maybe read some of the questions from the chat box that I'll ask the panelists to field based on their expertise.
Okay, sure. So our first question from the audience here is whether the panel has any thoughts on source of income resolutions in communities. And Shiloh touched upon that briefly, but I think it would be great to hear from others on the panel about that. And again, just briefly, these are local ordinances that have been adopted in a number of Central Ohio communities, led by first the city of Bexley and including Westerville, Worthington, City of Columbus, and I believe Reynoldsburg. Is that correct, Amy?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So, and what this legislation does is it says to landlords, you cannot refuse to rent housing to someone based on the type of income that they will be using, the source of income. So if it's veterans benefits or Social Security or a housing voucher, any of those kinds of income, in now these municipalities in Central Ohio, landlords are not allowed to use that as a reason not to rent to someone. So that's our first question from the audience, Steve.
I'm happy to give a response. And actually, this is totally related to Amy Claben, who has done an incredible job reaching out to all of these suburban areas to try to get people mobilized to seek, a revised non-discrim that includes source of income in their own municipalities. And so she reached out to us in Upper Arlington, and a group of us formed, and I think our group is called Building Welcoming Communities UA. And we've been on about a year-long journey of having the conversations, talking to city council members, talking to our city manager, and trying to figure out what are the pressure points that we need to pursue in order to get them to bring that vote before city council and then vote in favor of a revised non-discrim. It is really interesting how different places have different dynamics, and not to say that UA is unique, but it is interesting the conversations that we have had. City people in the city, they want to know, well, how many people will this really impact? Is there really enough, are there enough rental units that would be impacted by this for it to be a worthwhile endeavor to try to get this to happen? And they want to know, how do the landlords feel about it? Will the landlords be in support? And so, there's a lot of work for us to do in terms of outreach to landlords, understanding what their understanding is of source of income non-discrimination. There is a lot of misunderstanding around it. There's also been a lot of progress made in terms of supports for landlords around accepting different forms of non-discrim, but it's a little bit of an uphill battle. Ultimately, after going through an entire, sort of circuit of meeting people who are involved in this work, we have come back to, yes, this is the right thing for Upper Arlington, and partly because of what it signals to the community, that we are an inclusive community. We want to be an inclusive community, and accepting all forms of income is one signifier to that. So we've got work to do, but certainly I think this is work that needs to be happening in every community around Columbus, and I'm jealous of those places that have gotten it passed so far.
Thanks, Kathy. Let's go to another question in the interest of getting as many questions as we can, and I'll just field them to different panelists.
Great. So we have another question in the chat from Derek Birch, our high school teacher. His students who've been watching this streaming want to know in what ways they, as teenagers, can impact the inequalities in housing.
Judy, you've worked with Crystal Ray. Why don't you field this one?
Yes, I would love to. So first of all, I have to acknowledge these students for being proactive and participating today. It's incredible, really, that you're already a part of the conversation. I encourage you to continue to stay involved, learn to use your voice and speak up for others who may not look like you. Learn from others that don't look like you. So have conversations with people that don't look like you and don't agree with you, and see what you learn, and help to create a different future that we know is possible, but it's not going to be probable if you're not in the mix, because it's up to you. You are the future.
Can I add really quickly, because we've
Sure.
seen such success? Show up and speak at your Board of Education and your city council meetings. The leaders and the elected officials, they think very highly and take very seriously the words that are coming from our young people. And that's a huge opportunity for young people to get their voices heard and have it turn into change.
Steve, can I say one quick thing too?
Absolutely.
Everyone wants to speak with the teens. In New York City, there's a group called Teens Take Charge that have been pushing for school and neighborhood integration, and they're having a really big impact. They will call into radio shows when Mayor de Blasio is on and put him under pressure. And then in other places like St. Louis, kids actually walked out of school to boycott when there was an effort to resegregate the schools in the neighborhoods. So you have a lot of power. The media will pay attention to what you do. So definitely get involved. Yeah,
the power of the people, right? The dog can wag the tail, right? Next question, Kathy.
Yeah, so we have a question from the email. What should the municipalities in Central Ohio do to effectively cure the long-term effects of the housing discrimination and poverty that's happened and that we have seen is geographically segregated in our community? So, and I would say that question goes to all of the municipalities, both the urban and suburban municipalities.
Yeah, and I just a commentary. I was Chief Diversity Officer for the City of Columbus, and I sat in on a lot of zoning proceedings at City Council, and I left scratching my head, literally. But just suffice to say that zoning is driven by something other than common sense. Who wants to field this question?
I think we got to hear from Rick, please, as an outside source who doesn't live here.
Well, I think there are three things these communities, both Columbus and the surrounding suburbs, can do. One is to address this issue of source of income discrimination that we've heard about. You can pass local ordinances to address that just really shameful discrimination that's going on. I mean, imagine a young Black person who is low income. You know, they now have the right under the Fair Housing Act to not be discriminated based on race, and then they get hit with source of income discrimination. So that issue has to be addressed. A second issue, that we've been talking about is reducing exclusionary zoning. Minneapolis, Charlotte, other local communities have on their own said we're going to allow, legalize more types of housing in our community. And so that's something that all of these communities can do. And the third thing is really to support the efforts of Move to Prosper. I mean, in addition to tearing down the walls that exclude people, Move to Prosper is catapulting individuals over the walls that exist, and that's an effort that doesn't require government action. And so, in the immediate future, is something that that can be done as well.
Thank you. Maybe one more question.
Can I jump in really quick?
Sure.
I just have to add. So I'm Amy Clavin. I'm the president of Move to Prosper. And so thank you for the shout out on that one, Rick. But there's one other thing that we have to put on the agenda, which is you see so much development all over the region. Apartment communities are being built everywhere, but there's no requirement that they include a certain percentage of housing units for people who are lower income. We talk about workforce housing, which is very important. That's for predominantly people 80 to 120% of area median income. And oftentimes, because of the size of the units, it's for a single person or two people. We have to show up at city council meetings. We have to make our voices heard to public officials and to developers and builders throughout the community that we want to see all apartment communities have a percentage, 10 to 20% that are affordable. And we all have to speak up for that. I know that there are people here from the Ohio Housing Finance Agency, and thank you for being a part of today's conversation. Continue what you're doing for this type of inclusion, but we want to see mixed income developments and not saying, well, if you're lower income, you have to live over here. People should be everywhere throughout the region, have access to where the jobs are, have access to making the decisions for themselves, which we don't have. And the inclusion in many places, and Rick can talk to this, also includes for sale housing. We shouldn't have developments where all of the for sale housing is priced so high that people of lower means can't live there. There are examples around the country of where it's working. It doesn't change things for tomorrow, but over the long term, what do we want our community to look like in the future? We have to start today. So thank you. I just had to jump in.
That was so important, Amy, so important. You just crystallized the NIMBY versus the YIMBY, right? And we've got to focus on YIMBY. And it's this zoning and redlining has baked in for decades, centuries. And it's going to take a long time to unpack that, but it's only through steady, persistent, intentional mindset shift and action. Kathy?
So Steve, there are more questions in the chat. I'm going to suggest, I want to read one of the questions and then I'm going to suggest the answer will come this afternoon at our afternoon panel, which many of you are signed up for, and we hope everyone can join. So the question is, some central Ohio suburbs have started to densify and build multi-unit developments, but in many of these, it doesn't equate to affordability. What else can these communities do to attract affordable development? So this afternoon, we have a panel at 4 p.m. that is specifically going to talk about housing and whether we can have inclusive communities if we don't have inclusive housing. So thank you, Glenn and Sweeney, for that great question. I'm going to postpone it till this afternoon, and I'm going to turn things back over to Steve to move on to next steps and the next part of our panel.
Thank you, Kathy. And we will look towards wrapping this up. But first, we want each panelist to give a short one or 2 minute synopsis on a nugget, a next step nugget, an action item based on your experience and expertise that you would recommend to the audience we can take to move towards inclusive housing and inclusive neighborhoods. But starting with you, Rick, what next steps do you recommend for business, HR professionals, community leaders, et cetera, to broaden the discussion on DEI from workplace issues to where we live in our neighborhoods?
I would say get involved in these public discussions. I think that's government created this problem over decades, as you said, centuries, as you said, Steve. And so put pressure on governments, local governments and state government and the federal government to make change. To change the zoning policies, to change the source of income discrimination, to provide more mobility programs that will give families an opportunity to have more. And I want to underline what Amy said about inclusionary zoning. That's so important as well. As Kathy's been driving me around Columbus, I see apartment buildings everywhere, and they're, they look like beautiful communities. But if there's not an inclusionary zoning requirement, that is, you set aside 10, 20, 30% of units to be more affordable, then it's just creating separate and unequal one time over. And so I think getting involved in those discussions is vital.
Catherine, your thoughts? What's an action item? Give us a nugget.
Well, gosh, I feel like Rick pretty much took mine, which is, again, to get involved and to encourage people to have conversations with their neighbors about it, share information. What happens oftentimes is someone will say, I haven't heard about this. I haven't heard about redlining. What's your go-to book that you're going to suggest to people? I love The Color of Law is a great one. But absolutely, we have to start putting pressure at city council. Talk to your employers. Are your employers supporting these things? I think we just have to continue to apply pressure and pressure in numbers. So, seek out your local group that is targeting this and see how you can help mobilize people for support.
Thank you. What's your thoughts, Judy? What are your action items?
Well, I want to do two different shout outs. One is to all the baby boomers, and there are a lot of us out there that are approaching retirement and don't want to retire. They want to have a purpose in their life. And I'm encouraging them to get involved and help Move to Prosper, help become advocates in their communities, wherever their energy takes them. But here is a purpose worth fighting for. The second is I would like us to lean in on the CEO community in Columbus, the CEO partnerships, and help deepen their own understanding of why inequalities exist and how this is going to impact their own workforce of the future and what can they do, because they can do a lot. And it's about helping equip them with the knowledge that they need in order to make a difference.
Shiloh.
I'm going to pick up on Judy's shout out for Move to Prosper and give you some action items that are directly related to our work. So you heard Amy talk about source of income. If you want help with that in your municipality, please reach out. If you have an idea about a landlord that would love to be part of helping us house the next 100 families, please reach out. It could be as simple as sharing the recording of today's panel with friends of yours. You're going to get it later in the week. And if you think people could benefit from hearing this conversation, just forward it. We would be very happy for more people to have the opportunity to consume this content. And if you want to volunteer directly for us, I'm going to put my contact information into the chat and I will connect you on whatever level this really spoke to your heart today, because we'd love to have more people helping us get to know Central Ohio. Business leaders, landlords, donors, participants, right? We have a lot of work to do to get in front of Empower 100.
Well, thank you to our esteemed panelists. and to our very special guest, Rick Kahlenberg, for your outstanding, nuggets of wisdom, advice, experience, passion, and knowledge on these very important topics. Really, in the spirit of wrapping up, I wanted to direct you to the chat. There's a source that you can get more information about Move to Prosper. And it's great work. I've known Amy Klaben for years, and she's a very vocal and passionate champion about housing and the industry as a whole, and understands diversity, equity, inclusion very, very well, and has been an outstanding leader in our community in general. So thank you for making this possible, Amy. I always thank the technical support. Rachel Pack, thank you for making all this happen. And to our panelists, Catherine Kennedy, Judy Sonn, and Shiloh Todorov, thank you so much for your unique perspectives. If I could summarize this in one sentence, we've learned that this problem didn't happen overnight, and it's going to take intentional, consistent action from all aspects of our community. We talked about social determinants of health and political determinants of health. It's going to take society and it's a better understanding of DEI, and our elected officials who have the power to make change, to understand the importance and value of diversity, equity, inclusion, and have those glasses on as their lens as they form and shape policy. YIMBY, I love it, Rick. Yes, in my backyard. And that dovetails on Amy's very important point about inclusive zoning provisions in these new developments. It's imperative. And we know that diversity improves. It adds to, it doesn't take away from. And so we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about children and schools and how that impacts our neighborhood underpinning. I also wanted to give a last shout out to our sponsors, as they're shown on your screen, for their outstanding support of Move to Prosper and this exciting presentation on building inclusive communities. Amy, did you want to give a last comment before we close?
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to everybody for participating today. This is the first time I'm aware that there's been an intentional conversation in the community about connecting the DEI efforts to inclusion and the impact on children and creating a workforce for tomorrow. And so I hope that you can find ways to take this back to your employers, to your HR folks, to the broader community, so that we can continue this type of conversation. Because ultimately, if we're going to make change, we need to be very innovative about how the messages are carried out throughout the community. So it's not just housing people talking about housing and inclusion. This is about all of us finding ways to shape what our communities look like, who we live next to, and why it's important that we all, ourselves and our children, are able to grow up in an inclusive neighborhood. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day. And thank you to the wonderful panel today.